Reviewing today, The Witches by Roald Dahl. And apologies for the letters being in reversed image. It's just the way this camera works. You can see maybe this cover is the movie tie-in version. It says now a major motion picture in reverse letters. The only reason we got the movie tie-in version is that was the only version in stock. The inside is just the plain old witches. I've not seen the movie. This isn't going to talk about the movie. This is only going to talk about the book. So if you've been following this channel, you know I've been going back and rereading Roald Dahl books that I had read in my childhood, or rather that were read to me by teachers in my childhood. So Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, Charlie and the Great Glass Elevator, the BFG, and now The Witches. This was read to me, I believe it was in fourth grade. A fourth grade teacher read it to us for story time. It was either fourth or third grade. I think fourth grade. I haven't read it since then. I've reread it now, and it's largely as I remembered it, in contrast to these other books, which I had largely forgotten over the years. This one I remembered fairly well. Funny how some things stick in your brain and some things don't, but for whatever reason, this one stuck in my brain fairly well. So, not a lot of surprises, but it was fun to revisit this one. So, I'm going to talk about this, and fair warning, I'm going to assume that the audience for this video is people who've already read this book, because, you know, it's a childhood classic. Maybe you've forgotten some of the details over the years, as I have, and the purpose of this review maybe will just refresh some of those details for you, or talk about some parts. But I'm going to be spoiling everything. Just going to be going through the whole book and spoiling stuff. So yeah, this book, I didn't realize this when I was a kid, but this was actually published in the 80s. So it was read to me in the 80s, and it was published in the 80s. So it was a fairly new book when it was read to me. It was published, I guess, in 1983, first published. The illustrations are by Quentin Blake, who is credited as Roald Dahl's favorite illustrator. He's also the illustrator of all these other books here. Although in the case of the Charlie and the Chocolate Factory and Charlie and the Great Glass Elevator, he was not the original illustrator. He was brought on for the later editions. But I think by the 80s, he had become Roald Dahl's go-to illustrator. So BFG was originally illustrated by him, and still has his illustrations. And this one was originally illustrated by him. And because this is a children's book, I think the illustrations are just as much of the reading experience as the actual text. So Roald Dahl and Quentin Blake here. So this has got a lot of that classic Roald Dahl flavor to it. The dark humor is in here in spades. We have a number of children who are done in by the witches, either told as the backstory. So the grandma tells the backstory of children who are imprisoned in paintings by witches, or turned into chickens by witches, or turned into stone by witches. And then, as you know, if you remember this story, there are two boys who get turned into mice by the witches, one of which is the main character. And there are also... Where is it? There's three frogs who used to be children, who the main character stumbles upon, and who the witch says is going to feed to seagulls later. There are the frogs here. And their fate is unclear by the end of it. Whether they actually lived through it or whether they got fed to the seagulls. I like to think that they lived through it because by the end of the book, all the witches were turned into mice. I said I was going to spoil everything. But I'm getting ahead of myself. In many ways, it is a classic Roald Dahl book. It's got that very Roald Dahl dark humor. It's got the twisted creatures like the Grand High Witch. And it's got the classic illustrations by Quentin Blake, his favorite illustrator. But compared with these other books, it is different. The pacing is different. You have conversations that will go on for several pages. Now, granted, the page doesn't mean much because the print is very big. But still, and then, assuming you've read this book, you'll remember there's that big meeting of all the witches, where the main character is behind a screen and watching everything. Behind a screen here, watching the big meeting of the witches. And that scene goes on for 100 pages in my edition. If you count from the time the boy first enters the room to the very end of that encounter when he gets turned into a mouse. Here, that goes from page 77 to page 177. So it's 100 pages out of only a total of 325. So a good bulk of the book is just lingering on that one scene, which is very well done. It's very well done the way the tension keeps building in that scene, but it's a bit slower paced and more constrained and more focused than Roald Dahl's other books. Now, ordinarily, I would say the sheer absurdity of Roald Dahl or the sheer the fast-pacedness of it is part of the charm. But this book really pulls off what it wants to do. So it's more constrained, which you ordinarily might be a bad thing, but it really works here. After reading this book, I went to Wikipedia, where it said that he had a lot of help on this by an editor. I forget the name of the editor's name. And the way it was phrased in the Wikipedia, it says that it was given a lot of help by editor something. And it didn't say it was his editor. It just says an editor. So I don't know if that was his editor working with him or somebody who's happened to work as an editor who just helped Roald Dahl co-author the book. But yeah, you can see where this is maybe a little bit more like a normal book than some of Roald Dahl's other stuff. So that scene with the witches, where the witches are describing their plans to turn all the children into mice, and then when they turn poor Bruno Jenkins into a mouse, and then when they catch the main character and turn him into a mouse, that is all very well done. Even though I remember these scenes vividly from 4th grade, rereading it again really held my attention. Then after that, the main character and Bruno go back to grandmother and tell her what had happened. And then they hatch a plan. I'd actually forgotten about the second half of the book. The second part of the book, they hatch a plan to turn the mouse maker poison or the mouse maker potion on the witches themselves. So they hatch a plan where he's going to go in, steal the mouse maker potion, put it in all the witches' food, and turn them all into mice. From this point onwards, the second half of the book, it becomes very predictable because then essentially you're just watching this plan play out more or less exactly as they planned it. You know, there are a few moments of suspense, getting the potion out of the witch's room, almost getting caught by the witch. having to sneak into the kitchen and dodge all the chefs as they're trying to catch him as a mouse when he's in the kitchen. Um, here they are all trying to step on him, and he's got to escape. But those moments of tension aside, the basic plot is from that point on is very predictable. They just do what they plan to do for the second half. And then, let me jump back to talk about Bruno Jenkins. I was talking earlier this month, I believe, about the Harry Potter books, which I was also rereading, the first Harry Potter book. And I remarked that the beginning of Harry Potter is just straight out of a Roald Dahl book. And I meant that in a good way, where Harry Potter has had this, oppressed childhood, very much like a Roald Dahl character. And Jim, from Jim's books, Reading and Stuff, made the comment that the fat, spoiled kid, Dudley Dursley in Harry Potter, is straight out of Roald Dahl. And I said, yeah, you're right. I missed that. But of course, you're right. And Bruno Jenkins is exactly like Dudley Dursley from the Harry Potter. So this was published first, obviously, so you can see where J.K. Rowling gets her influences from. He's just completely spoiled by parents who just indulge him with everything. Really greedy, just wants everything, wants to be eating all the time, and he's a bit of a bully, likes tormenting small animals. He was burning ants with his magnifying glass when the main character runs into him. So, the classic spoiled rich. Sorry, I was going to say rich kid. Classic spoiled fat kid. Also a rich kid in this case. Right from the Roald Dahl, J.K. Rowling archive. It's interesting to reflect back on this and note that Bruno Jenkins is completely superfluous to the plot. Him getting turned into a mouse, we didn't really need that because the main character got caught and turned into a mouse by the end of that section. So having two boys who are turned into mice is a little bit superfluous. One would do, especially since for the rest of the book, Bruno Jenkins doesn't really do anything except just eat and be really greedy and eat all the time. But he is very welcome comic relief, and so he really helps to lighten up the book. So when the main character first meets him, Bruno Jenkins is eating a sandwich and is so busy eating the sandwich that one of the witches dropped that he doesn't realize he's been turned into a mouse. Then actually, if I'm going to nitpick things, I found that a little bit hard to believe because during his metamorphosis, he runs off directly after it. It seems like the kind of thing you would notice. It's later described when the main character goes through the same metamorphosis as being something very painful. But whatever. The joke is he didn't even realize he was turned into a mouse because he was so busy eating, and the main character has to say to him, look at yourself. And then once he looks at himself, he realizes he's a mouse. Then they go and meet the grandma, and the grandma has to take Bruno Jenkins back to his parents. And his parents, of course, don't believe that their son's really been turned into a mouse. So she goes back, and of course Bruno Jenkins' parents are really nasty people, just like the Dursleys are just like the standard Roald Dahl characters. And they don't listen to Grandma. And then Grandma finally gives up and just says, here's your son. And she puts the mouse down. And they freak out and they try to whack the mouse with their newspaper. So the grandmother just has to take Bruno Jenkins back and put him back in her bag and take him back to her room. And then they get back in the room and she said, why didn't you say anything to your parents? Because, they can talk when they're mice. And it's established that they have exactly their same normal voices with the same level of volume, even though they've been turned into mice. And Bruno Jenkins says, well, I was too busy eating. So there's this whole scene going on where his parents are freaking out and where Grandma is trying to return him. And he wants to be returned to his parents. But, yeah. Why on earth didn't you speak up and tell your father who you were? She said to Bruno. Because I had my mouth full, Bruno said. He jumped straight back into the bowl of bananas and went on with his eating. It's implied by the end of the book, and this is where we get back to Roald Dahl's dark humor again, that Bruno Jenkins was done in by his parents. Let me read from that part here, page 301. One evening, as I lay on my grandmother's lap in front of the fire, she said to me, I wonder what happened to that little Bruno. I wouldn't be surprised if his father gave him to the hall porter to drown in the fire bucket, I answered. I'm afraid you may be right, my grandmother said. The poor little thing. So that's Roald Dahl's dark humor there for you. As a kid, I remembered that section, and I thought, okay, that's essentially what happened to him then. That this is just as good as the author Roald Dahl saying this is what happened. But my wife, who read this book before I did, before I reread it, I'm piggybacking on my wife's reading, which is why I'm going through these books again. She read that and she didn't actually think that that really meant that Bruno had been drowned. She just took it literally that they were speculating that was what had happened, but Bruno Jenkins, the mouse, was probably still out eating sandwiches somewhere. So I guess that's open to debate. Whether or not we should take this as Roald Dahl essentially telling us, yes, the mouse has been drowned, or whether it's Roald Dahl saying, well, who knows? I mean, obviously, to a certain extent, it is Roald Dahl saying, well, who knows? But I think he's heavily implying, and he's the author. So if that's the last thought that he leaves you with, that means that's what he wants you to imagine what happened, which means that's probably what happened, right? But yeah, we can debate it. And then the book ends with grandmother and the mouse. What is the name of the main character? Does the main character have a name? Yeah, it's told in the first person. So so it's always like I said. But what is the name of the main character? I'm just now realizing in the middle of this review that I don't remember the main character's name. And I'm not sure he has a name. It's something to check on Wikipedia. Anyways, at the end, the two of them are making plans to go and hunt down the rest of the witches in Norway. They've gotten the address of the Grand High Witch headquarters, and they're going to make a plan to turn them all into mice. So, it ends obviously with kind of maybe a sequel all set up. that the grandmother and the main character are going to go on another adventure to catch more witches. Unfortunately, we'll never get to see that story because Roald Dahl has now passed away. And I don't think it would be at all interesting if somebody else wrote it, huh? Yeah. Does the main character have a name? I don't know. Uh, yeah. Oh, wait. The main character does have a name, doesn't it? I'm remembering this from the beginning. It was. I think he had the same name as Roald Dahl, right? Yeah, where was that? Wasn't in the very. There was something that was similar to Roald Dahl's backstory. So Roald Dahl's parents were Norwegian, which is why he has the name Roald. Which, if you see him pronounce it on a YouTube video or something like that, he pronounces it with more of a throat vowels than I can do. Um, and I think I'm actually now remembering something about the beginning of the book. Have, maybe he doesn't have the similar name. Maybe I'm just misremembering that. All right. Anyways, uh, one last note. I went to Wikipedia after after I read this book, and Wikipedia said that this book was often banned from libraries and was apparently high on the list of books that are often challenged in libraries because some people viewed it as misogynistic. Um, I didn't research it any further than the Wikipedia article, and it occurs to me just now as I'm talking that you have to be a little bit careful because sometimes these reports of banned books are a little bit sensationalized. Um, but assuming, for the sake of argument, that that is what actually happened, that this book was actually banned from several libraries or challenged from several libraries, I think that's just ridiculous. For one thing, I don't think this book is misogynistic. I mean, sure, the women are witches, and the witches are bad guys. Sorry, I phrased that wrong. The witches are women. It's certainly not the case that all women are witches, but the witches do happen to be women, and the witches are the bad guys. But nowhere is it implied that all women are supposed to be bad. And maybe I guess you could take issue with the image of the witch being evil in the first place, and you can try and untangle this cultural baggage. But this is cultural baggage that long predates this book. I mean, I've been reading the Brothers Grimm lately. That's full of evil witches. It's not. It's not Roald Dahl trying to be misogynistic. It's just Roald Dahl using this archetype character that's already in our culture. And I don't really even put much stock in the fact that the idea of a witch just in and of itself is misogynistic. I just think it's just an evil creature that happens to be a woman. But even if you were going to accept that there was a little bit of a misogynistic tinge in here, I don't see. I think it's slight enough that to try and get something banned from a library, to try and challenge something from a library, on just yeah, something as subtle as that is just not a good use of people's time. It's interesting though. Wikipedia said it was like one of the most banned or challenged books from libraries in the 1990s. Um, which is interesting because people talk about cancel culture nowadays as if it's something new. And that's just a reminder that some of this stuff has been going on for a long time. But yeah, that little rant over with. I think that's really all I've got to say about this book. So yeah, I'll just end the review here.